review documents. They don't get to take those documents, but they definitely can review the documents in accordance to the audit process they want to undertake. That any opinion with regards to any differences between the auditor and or department or the ministry, that those matters, the Attorney General, in terms of what are commercially sensitive or proprietary and subject to confidentiality, are worked out. And so if it is the intent of the government to be sincere in meeting what they've publicly said, the motion that is offered and or any of the mechanisms that can be associated with it, that there is a precedent in place that could facilitate the Office of the Auditor General undertaking its work to maintain the confidentiality and the proprietary matters at hand, and quite frankly would also show the goodwill and the basis of coming here in the fall session of the legislature to enact enabling legislation to support it. And so for the government to say it can't be done, it's about the will of the government to want to lead and to show Nova Scotians whose trust has been shaken in the very institution of government, both the legislature and that of the cabinet, to show goodwill and to show that we're moving forward steadfast in our resolve for transparency.
Yeah, Mr. Pereira.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, we just want to make it clear that we are in no way questioning the integrity or the efficiency or the Office of the Auditor General himself. We believe that he has the capacity to hold those documents, and in our experience with him recently, he has treated those documents very responsibly. But what we would like to do is clear up once and for all the question of what the limits of cabinet confidentiality and solicitor client privilege are. We would like to know to what extent the Office of the Auditor General and the Public Accounts Committee can be protected from releasing documents to third parties. There are very big issues here, and those are issues that go back for a couple of hundred years now, Madam Chair, and this is a good time for us to resolve them. But this has nothing to do with this particular report, but it has everything to do with some pretty important principles. I do want to say also that the mandate of this committee itself, as spelled out in the in our documents, say that in carrying out its role, the committee will seek to obtain all financial information and documents necessary for the committee's work, except for records which are privileged in the narrowest sense, such as executive council papers, and that's in the documents in our terms of reference. And there is a question there, and there always has been a question as to what that means. What does it mean in the narrowest sense of such as executive council papers? I also want to add that the member from Preston has talked about precedents, and I want to say that the precedent he cites involves a series of hearings that he was involved in 2007 and 2008. And at that time, there were 3 questions that were put on the agenda, none of which involved cabinet confidentiality. And the committee met in camera and dealt with it and decided that they were not confidential documents. And the committee itself ruled out looking at cabinet confidential documents in that process. On solicitor-client privilege, I want to quote the member from Preston at that committee, and he was talking about documentation. He said, when we got the documentation, and this is a documentation relating to that hearing, it was blanked out, cabinet confidentiality, and it was a memo between staff members that's beyond belief, right? So whether the question of memos between staff members are protected. I can understand in one way, and I'm not protecting the government in any way, don't get me wrong with my statement that I'm going to say here. I can understand where certain things in cabinet are confidential. Being a former cabinet minister, there are certain things that are confidential and could hurt companies. I know as a committee we did everything we possibly could to ensure that the companies were not hurt in any way, except for the negative publicity that came out of this because of the nature of the grants. They're not loans, but they're grants. That I can understand. When the cabinet minister comes and says, this I can't discuss because it may cause some problems for the companies. In other words, Madam Chair, the member from Preston knows full well that there are cabinet confidential documents, and the issue at hand is whether or not those cabinet confidential documents can be broadly or narrowly defined. And he knows that there are also solicitor-client privilege related to the actions of companies and documents given to the government in trust. And those issues have been dealt with before, and it is that experience that has led us to the conclusion that we do need some definitive legislation to deal with this question of cabinet confidence and solicitor-client privilege. And that's why we would like to introduce legislation in the fall, and at that point, give the Auditor General all of the documents he needs to continue his audit and to do the great work that he does.
Thank you, Mr. Pereira. Mr. Wynot, did you want to add to that, or is that complete?
You know, Madam Chair, my honourable colleague from Halifax Citadel Save-A-Line did a very good job at summarizing what I was going to say. Thank you.
Okay. Well, okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And, you know, I also wanted to say as chair of this committee that we are all aware, and we've had our training as well, about the important role we play in supporting the Office of the Auditor General, and that the work of the Auditor General, you know, reports here to our committee, and we do all that we can to facilitate, you know, in a very positive way, the work that he does, so that we are the eyes and ears, really, of the legislature as his work is reported. And we have a responsibility, I think, as well, to facilitate and to support that work. And when a report is brought to us that suggests that the Auditor General's office was impeded, I think it is important that we consider what we can do. So this is an appropriate motion, I believe, before us. In the report we got last week, just in the little summary, I would just like to remind the members, it says the Auditor General's Act, and this is from the Auditor General himself, but the Auditor General Act requires that all documents, whether confidential or not, be provided to the Auditor General, and does not contain any exemption for cabinet submissions or solicitor-client communications. So for the Auditor General's Act, you know, we should consider that the auditor feels that he is empowered to do this. Mr. Clark, and I know we're moving towards having the motion called. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And on the issue of the ability to look at the transactions with regards to a file relating to a department, there is an ability to have those documents reviewed. With the matter of cabinet confidentiality, cabinets must have the ability, and I do echo the fact, to have a discussion around a document and not be impeded from those discussions in confidence. However, the issue of if government wants to allow the actual mechanics or the technical aspects of a file to be looked at in terms of the accounting and the due diligence around the work associated, not the decisions, because cabinet can make those decisions, but the work associated with files being in accordance to the proper processes and procedures in accounting, that's a totally other thing. And that's where my point is, the government has that at their discretion and ability to allow for that with a negotiated process that protects the other covenants that would be in place around cabinet confidentiality. And I would say here, never would I vote to impede cabinet's ability to do its work as the Executive Council needs to do its work. And as the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island said, there is a centuries-long process in our parliamentary tradition that has honored that, and precedence has been, when that has been tampered with, it has not benefited the jurisdiction that has dealt with it in the political expediency of the moment or the day that's been there. So I do agree with common ground, and I welcome the legislation. It's a matter, as time moves on, issues become before government and the public. We know we're under greater scrutiny at this time and need to respond in an appropriate, transparent manner. But again, if the will is there for government to work out a process that allows for the review of documents for the actual processing of a loan or the like, and those transactions to be reviewed is one thing, separate from the decision-making of a cabinet around them. So again, in being supportive of this, I also think that this has also presented further discussion. I know the government's position on this, and I suspect when we go to a vote, I know the outcome, but I will take the government as well at its word that we will find a way forward, and it's still not impossible for the government to do the right thing in the interim and show some next steps and to set their own precedents of collaboration and cooperation to move forward with legislation that will show examples of how it can work.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. I have two speakers, Mr. Caldwell and then Mr. Pereira.
Yes, I I respect the comments by my honourable colleagues. Unfortunately, the quotes were my quotes from the past, which were accurate, was for information being supplied to the Public Accounts Committee, not to the Auditor General. And my comments in that regard were taken out of context. And I still stand by those comments when it comes to this committee. We are asking in this resolution that the information go to the Auditor General, not this committee. Very clear on that, to the Auditor General. The Auditor General has a right to get this information. He has a right to report on the processes that he has to review in these different departments to ensure that the public interest is protected, not in the future when an act is put in place, which if the act is written properly and followed through properly, it's something I'm sure our caucus will support. But in the meantime, the work of the Auditor General's office has been impeded by this government. It appears that there's some information they don't want made public, and I can only draw conclusions what that may be. But again, without the Auditor General going through their process and indeed doing his work, that will not be released from the standpoint of any confidential information that would come from either cabinet documents or from staff reports or from businesses that may be affected by this. I think that the government has taken a very poor position on this, and indeed this information should be provided immediately to the Auditor General, and I stress to the Auditor General. And we have no precedent on this before that I'm aware of, that the committee has come forward and asked for the Auditor General to be provided information because he simply can't get it. So I would ask my colleagues to consider that. I'm sure they're going to vote against this. I will be requesting a recorded vote when the time comes to ensure we have this on the record, that the government has no interest in providing the Auditor General with the information to do his work.
Mr. Pereira.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I want to say that I agree completely with the member from Cape Breton North. You know, there have been occasions in the past where we have been able to, after a very long, drawn-out debate and struggle, come up with some arrangements to transfer some documents. What we want to avoid are those constant one-off fights and establish a strong base for the Auditor General to receive those reports. So we're in complete agreement with him, and he clearly agrees with us that we need legislation to clear up this area so that we don't have to deal with these situations. The member from Preston has a very short-term memory if he thinks that there is no precedent for these types of debates, and he and I sat together for a long time when we were looking at the immigration files, and I think he's forgotten that. But on the question of you know, the powers and authorities of the Act and how they relate to cabinet confidentiality, there is a great deal of litigation. There's a conflict of law here, if not legal opinion, and that needs to be cleared up by legislation. And so what we're saying is we want to strengthen the capacity of the Public Accounts Committee and the Auditor General to get the documents without going through the rigmarole that we usually go through. And we want the Auditor General to get the documents that he needs to do the job. And most of the information that the Auditor General is looking for happened under a previous government. So it's not that we have any particular political gain we can't make any particular political gain from saying, you know, that was done by the former government. But there is a very important principle at stake here, and those the principles of cabinet confidentiality and solicitor client privilege. And we shouldn't just deal with it just because, you know, some political posturing or grandstanding by members of the legislature. These are important principles, and they need to be discussed in a rational, logical way, and that's all we're saying.
Question.
Yes, and you had asked for a recorded vote, Mr. Caldwell? I heard yes, and is that seconded? It has, I believe, 2 members. And Mr. Clark has seconded that. So we'll have a recorded vote on the motion before us, and I will begin with Mr. Epstein.
Nay.
Mr. Wynot?
No.
Mr. Ramey?
No.
And Mr. McKinnon?
No.
Mr. Pereira?
No.
Mr. Caldwell?
Yes.
And Mr. Clark?
Aye.
And I myself will vote in favor, so I say aye, which makes it 3-5, and the motion is defeated. So, Mr. Pereira, did you want to add to that?
Yes, Madam Chair, I would like to move another motion.
Okay, you may move another motion.
Madam Chair, I move that the documents, that the Public Accounts Committee recommends that the documents requested by the Auditor General pertinent to Nova Scotia Business Inc. and the Industrial Expansion Fund be released to the Auditor General as soon as the appropriate legislative safeguards are in place.
Okay. Is that clear to everybody? I know we haven't had the opportunity to have a look at it. Mr. Epstein is seconding the motion. Thank you very much, which makes it official. Any questions or comment from Mr. Clark?
Just in terms of when we get a process in place that we'll think about, but we're not going to show you in advance or disclose that, I'm wondering, can you just, could the honourable member just read the statement fully again for me?
Yes, if you could repeat it, Mr. Epstein. I'm sorry, Mr. Pereira.
The motion, the effective part of it reads that the Public Accounts Committee recommends that documents requested by the Auditor General pertinent to Nova Scotia Business Inc. and the Industrial Expansion Fund be released to the Auditor General as soon as the appropriate legislative safeguards are in place.
Mr. Caldwell, did you have a comment?
Yes, I can see where we're going with this, and I know we're going to lose this whole thing, but I'd like to make an amendment to that motion.
Keep me on my toes.
I think we should include the Department of Health section under the mental health that was also a problem by the Auditor General.
Okay.
I'd like to make that as a friendly amendment.
Is that acceptable to you, Mr. Pereira?
Yeah, definitely. The motion really speaks to the legislative power that will be granted to, I suspect, all departments in the Auditor General, so we have no problem with that.
Okay. It just highlights the fact that 3 departments were impacted in the last report.
Sure,
Okay.
yeah, I think that's a good amendment.
Very good. So if there's no further comment, any further discussion? No. In the absence of that, we'll have a vote on that. So all those in favor, please say aye. As amended, yes, the motion that we've just accepted as amended, including mental health. Those in favor, I'll just do it once more. Those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. And the motion has passed unanimously. Yes, unanimously for the record. Very good. Mr. Caldwell?
Madam Chair, I have another resolution here and a motion. Whereas during the course of the attempting to conduct full performance audits of Nova Scotia Business Incorporated, Department of Economic Development and Rural Development, Industrial Expansion Fund, the Department of Health, Mental Health Services, the senior management of the above, Crown Corporation, and Department refused to provide the information required by the Office of the Auditor General. And whereas the mandate of the Public Accounts Committee includes a review of the report of the Auditor General, which requires full transparency and accountability without exception. And whereas it is clear that the current Executive Council gave direction to the senior management to withhold from the Office of the Auditor General documents that were required for the completion of the above-mentioned performance audit. And whereas the Auditor General has pointed out that this practice constitutes an unwarranted interference with the audit process, and that it represents poor accountability to the House of Assembly. And whereas this resulted in an incomplete audit in one instance and compelled the Auditor General to issue denial of an opinion on his audit of the operation of Nova Scotia Business Incorporated and the Industrial Expansion Fund, and pointed out the denial of an audit opinion is the most severe audit sanction available to him. Therefore resolved that the committee direct the clerk to request Mr. Darrell Dexter, MLA, for Cole Harbour, President of the Executive Council, that he appear before this committee on June 16th, 2010. So moved.
Thank you very much, and that's seconded. Mr. Clark, thank you. Mr. Pereira, comment?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, you know, once again, we're here into this silly posturing and grandstanding on the part of the member from Preston. I'm not even going to dignify this by responding to his whereases, but I would like to say that he knows.
Yep. Point of order, Mr. Caldwell.
It's on parliamentary language that the member is using, and I've asked him to withdraw all those comments.
Yes, I wonder if you would withdraw those comments, please.
Which part of the comments would you like to withdraw, Madam Chair?
Well, grandstanding, posturing. I think here, what we're working on here is to try and further the work of the Auditor General. And the comments of the Auditor General were clear that he's been denied his audit opinion. Particularly the preamble comes almost directly from the Auditor General's report. Many of the quotes are from there. So I think I see it as attacking the Auditor General's words as well. I think it's important that we look at this.
I'm sorry, I thought I was pretty clear when I said the member from Preston was grandstanding and engaging in silly posturing, and I thought that part of it was relatively clear, Madam Chair. And I believe, but if you'd like me to withdraw that, I will, and say that he's
personal comments. That's all. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, well, I apologize to the member for Preston that he's, engaging in this kind of, feels the need to engage in this kind of behavior to get the attention he lacks.
Thank you. Mr. Caldwell.
This is an important topic for this committee. It's an important topic for the people of Nova Scotia. Now, if I'm being accused by this honourable member of using this posturing and silly approaches this thing, he wants to reconsider his position on this committee. This committee is here to ensure that the accountability for the people of Nova Scotia and that the Auditor General get the information he wants. If he keeps to the topic here, I would appreciate it very, very much. This is not silly. This is not out of order. This is what this committee should be doing. And if the government would have done what they're supposed to have done in the first place and released this information to the Auditor General, we wouldn't be having this discussion today.
Mr. Pereira.
Madam Chair, I would have been less likely to treat this as posturing if he had submitted his motion to this committee first and not released it to the media and had a general discussion and before actually introducing it to this committee or engaging in some kind of a sane debate of this issue. And that's what I mean. I mean, it's really playing to the galleries, Madam Chair, more than trying to do something important, something that'll serve the long-term public interest of Nova Scotians. And if he had been serious about that, he would have presented a well-thought-out motion to this committee and submitted for discussion and debate before engaging in that type of behavior. But I do want to say, Madam Chair, that he knows full well that this committee does not have the authority, it does not have the precedent, and it does not have the necessity to do what he proposes to do. And that, too, leads me to conclude that it's nothing more than posturing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Question.
Thank you. I would just say that I had the opportunity to speak to our legal counsel before the meeting and that he as well had seen the motions and had said that it was certainly in order. And there have been precedents for the Public Accounts Committee to do very similar, in fact, perhaps the same model of approach that is in place today. So that would relate to 2006 when we invited people from Executive Council around the Magic Valley and S&J Potatoes. So just to know that it is in order and has been reviewed by our legal counsel. Mr. Pereira, we want to have the motion, but I will give you the opportunity.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I have looked at the minutes from those meetings very, very carefully, and I know that the minister who appeared there had resigned at that point. He was no longer a minister, and he came voluntarily. I also know that the former premier was there, and he was no longer the premier, and he too came voluntarily. Those are not precedents, Madam Chair.
Mr. Caldwell.
I just want to address my honourable member to my left here. And it gets this posturing he calls and all this, the way this has been done. This was sort of a precedent set by Mr. Steele, our present finance minister. And I have the minutes of that meeting where Mr. Steele did ask for the premier to come forward and these documents in place. So I would assume that the negative comments that the honourable member has presented towards me, he directs the same comments towards Mr. Steele as finance minister.
Mr. McKinnon.
Madam Chair, I'd just like to go on record that Mr. Steele will be a very integral part of the solution that will be brought forward in the fall to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. Mr. Caldwell, would you?
Recorded vote.
Okay, a request for a recorded vote. Is that seconded? Mr. Clark, and so we'll have a recorded vote on the motion before us, which is that the committee direct the clerk to request of Mr. Darrell Dexter, who is not only the MLA for Cole Harbour, but also the President of the Executive Council, to appear before the committee on June 16th, to be specific. Now, and could I begin with Mr. Epstein?
Nay.
Mr. Wynot?
No.
Mr. Ramey?
No.
Mr. McKinnon?
No.
Mr. Pereira?
No.
Mr. Caldwell?
Yes.
And Mr. Clark?
Aye.
And I myself will vote yes, which makes it 5-3, and the motion is defeated. So that motion is over. And is there any further business for the committee? Yes. And, we are going to have an agenda setting as well. Are we finished with this business now? Okay, very good. So we'll put that aside and look to the agenda setting for the Public Accounts Committee. And we have a list before us. I believe the clerk has given everybody the list that we had been working on. I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that the Auditor General last week in making his presentation to us asked very specifically that we look at the 3 chapters that were reviewed in the report we had just received. So that was one request that I think we should all be well aware of and take note, and I hope we will have on our upcoming list. So that would include NSBI and the IEF, which was the business loans section, mental health, and the third one was contaminated sites. And we do have mental health, just so the committee knows, mental health is on the agenda for June 23rd. We already had that in advance of the report. So I think that means we have one of those already attended to. And the way we have done this in the past to set up our meetings, again, just to reiterate, we really have a full schedule for June. We don't have a meeting set on June 30th. And that's really in light of the fact that it's graduation season. I know a lot of MLAs are busy. And we also are on the eve of Canada Day, which is another day when we are very busy in our constituencies. So we were looking at not going beyond the 23rd of June this year. Our precedent is not to meet during the summer months. So as long as I see agreement among our committee members, we'll maintain that precedent. So what we're doing now really is trying to arrange several items so that we can have them all lined up for September and begin the committee's work, you know, in fulsome work in the fall. So that's why I would ask that we start looking at the list. Does everybody have the list before them of both the new items from the Conservative Caucus? There's a memo that was sent out June 4th. And also the previous list of topic witnesses, which has all 3 caucuses on one page. Is everybody well prepared? Okay, so what we would like to do in setting that up, and our pattern in the last meeting that we had, where we've begun now to set the agenda in public, was to give the floor to, you know, in turn to each caucus to propose an item and then to have that voted upon. So, Mr. Pereira, did you want to talk about the process?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you know, and as I said earlier today, we would like very much to discuss the Auditor General's recent report, and we had agreed in previous meetings that this would be our top priority once the report was released. And to that end, we had put mental health on the list, and I'm glad to hear that that will be dealt with on the 23rd. And I would also like to have environmental remediation put on that list, and I propose that we do that on the 16th, on June 16th.
We also have an item on June 16th, I'm sorry, so we are booked through this month. June 16th is the Gaming Corporation, and we've been waiting for them. The members may remember I actually sent a letter to the CEO asking that she make herself available because there have been a number of cancellations.
Okay.
Yes, so it's scheduled now. So we have the 16th, the Gaming Corp, and the 23rd, Mental Health. So can we go into September? Mr. Pereira.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to formally move that we look at the Auditor General's chapter on environmental remediation on the 16th, on June 16th.
So you want to move the Gaming Corporation?
Yes.
And that is what is before
Yes.
us. Yes, Mr. Clark.
Madam Chair, if it's scheduled, it's scheduled. So if we'd like to do an additional meeting that day, I have no issue with that. So we can accommodate both. We just have to meet and maybe, forego another meeting, but we'll do a morning meeting and then a 1 to 3 meeting. Why not? And then we've accommodated both of them. So if that's the case, I have no issue with that from our caucus.
Mr. Caldwell?
I would agree with that approach.
Yeah. And Mr. Pereira?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I noticed that the Conservatives have put the Atlantic Lottery Corporation on their agenda, and I'm wondering if perhaps, given that there's a review of the whole gaming strategy that will be released in late September, early October, would it not make sense to roll those two up and do that at the same time? There's no particular urgency, but we do have a principle that has operated through this committee that the Auditor General's report gets priority. And you know, he has talked not just about environmental remediation. He's talked about other things, and we have agreed that we will pay primary attention to the Auditor General when those reports are released. And when we discussed this topic earlier, we had put mental health to, on the agenda in that parking space, but we had also agreed in principle that we would look at the other chapters in the Auditor General's report, and I'm suggesting that we follow that practice and look at mental health and environmental remediation next. Yeah. And hold the industrial expansion funds subject to that motion that this committee has agreed to.
Mr. Clark?
Well, Madam Chair, I have no issue with adding to, but it's already been moved and scheduled, so you can't go and rescind that. But I have no problem whatsoever with having an additional meeting or sitting that day to deal with the matter he's presenting. And so as far as what I'm looking at is, I have no problem moving and expanding our time that we meet on that day to have a separate second standalone session. But you can't go and start moving motions to change what's already been set. That just doesn't be the precedent.
I appreciate that. And one of the comments I would make is that this committee will look silly if we push the CEO of the Gaming Corporation to please make herself available after canceling us on, I think, 2 occasions prior to that. And we had indicated to her that this is a serious committee, that we expected government officials to make themselves available. And then if we bump her at the 11th hour, I don't think that that's very good management of our committee. So I would, certainly, feel that that's just not the right stance. I agree with the member from Cape Breton North and appreciate that he's made a suggestion that we just make our committee available for 2 meetings. I'd be fine to do that. And I would also say there's some doubt about whether or not we could schedule within 1 week. I'm sure that the support staff, our clerk and research staff from the library might be concerned about getting everything ready for us in a single week and finding whether or not our Environment Department could return in 1 week's time. Mr. Pereira?
Madam Chair, we do have a motion that we replace the Nova Scotia Gaming Corporation on June 16th with the environmental remediation.
Yes. Mr. Clark?
The point of order, Madam Chair, is that the agenda has already been set. If he wants to add to that, it's one thing, but if the committee is going to go, any given meeting going forward can just be suppressed by whatever other topic that comes up. There has to be some continuity. And I don't think it's in order that you can change that agenda that has been set and agreed to prior by this committee. The suggestion that both can meet, and basically the movement of an additional meeting that day is totally in order, and I would support that.
And so would I. Thank you.
But I don't believe and with all due respect to my honourable colleague, it's not in order because this committee has already set that in motion, and I think we can add to that, but I don't think it's in order to start changing it, or there'll never be continuity. There's an agenda set for a reason.
I agree with you there too. Mr. Pereira?
Yes, Madam Chair. The committee is the author of its own fate. The committee can do what it wants in terms of setting the agenda, in terms of when it wants to meet and who it wants to call. And earlier, the member from Preston and Cape Breton North had said we have the authority to compel anyone to do anything. And I think that includes the ability to change our agenda in the light of circumstances.
I would just ask Mr. Pereira whether there is a compelling reason to change this agenda. And I've made the point that the only letter I have written on behalf of the committee this year has been to the CEO of the Gaming Corp, urging her to make herself available as fast as possible and as soon as we could arrange it. Mr. Caldwell's been waiting. Is that okay? Mr. Caldwell?
Yes, this really disturbs me because here's a member that actually agreed to, and the members from the the NDP Caucus or members here agreed to having the Gaming Corporation here, and now they're going to change the rules. I think the honourable member from the PC Caucus, this idea of having 2 meetings in the same day is an excellent idea, and I just wonder if this is an approach by the government to suppress the gambling report, and if that's the case, I'm a little bit concerned about that.
Thank you. Mr. Clark, did you have a point of order?
My point of order is that the motion is not in order.
All right.
And the honourable colleague that talks about due process, well, there is an established due process of agenda setting. It had been committed to. There is no superseding reasons or extraordinary reasons that would change that. That has been set. I don't believe, and I'm asking you to rule, that that motion is in order. And if it is deemed that there is not consensus in that opinion, then I would seek the interpretation of the Speaker or alleged counsel. But
thank you, Mr. Clark. And I was actually going to turn over to Mr. Hebb and see if, as counsel for our committee, if he could advise me whether this motion is in order and advise the committee. We're obviously split.
Madam Chair, I believe the motion is in order. I think it is always open to the committee. It may not be appropriate. The result may be that you won't have anybody next week because you have no guarantee that you have someone to replace, but I think the committee can always change its mind with respect to its agenda.
Okay. Mr. Clark?
yes.
We have
well,
an
I
hour
heard,
for
and I've
this
got
meeting.
something to say, so you can call the question as much as you want. There's a motion on the floor, if that's the case. And what's the motion? Because I've asked now, Madam Chair, with regards to this position, what the government's clearly saying is they do not, and to the point of alleged counsel, they may have their parliamentary procedure with regards to doing it, but they're setting a very bad precedent. And for the honourable member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island to sit here previously on motions that I would understand and argue about us doing the right things. What they're saying is whenever Cabinet gives them a direction that they're not comfortable with the topic of the day, that they'll just come in and use their voting majority to change the agenda, even though an agenda has been set up, has been set for the appropriate reasons. We're seeing that time and time again, and there is a parliamentary issue, which will come back before the House, that there is no agenda anymore because this government is showing it can't honour its word. So there is an issue of this committee's ability to function if we as a caucus have prepared for a meeting next week or the subsequent meeting and cannot have any ability for us to be able to do that because they will come in when they're not comfortable and been told to change the direction, told to come in here and to bring those matters forward, and then at the same time, Madam Chair, try to tell Nova Scotians that this is open and accountable, that they want to change the way that politics is done in Nova Scotia, that they want Nova Scotians to believe that the Dexter government is somehow ushering in a new era of parliamentary decorum, when we as parliamentary caucuses are being totally dismissed from what was built as consensus and put in place before, that these types of things that come forward are totally, in my opinion, inappropriate for them to start doing. If they want to gerrymander the legislative agenda or the scheduling agenda of the Public Accounts Committee, then there is no need for public accounts to meet. Why should we come to this chamber if the government can't maintain and honor their word of previous decisions and meetings? And when the opposition is willing to have an additional meeting to accommodate their request, so if the government wants to keep superseding and adding new topics, we'll come and we'll discuss those topics if that's the case, to be able to bring those forward. But Madam Chair, what I know is that the government, as my honourable colleague from Preston has said, is uncomfortable with the topic, doesn't want it discussed because they haven't finished the fix of what the report's going to be, even though there's ongoing issues that have been brought before this committee and are of public interest to have considered. So the government members may have a majority on this committee, but they needn't think for a moment that they are somehow going to go out and say they're doing all these good things. We agreed, and I understand if the government's going to come back with legislation on one front to try and make themselves open and transparent and then hijack a process that's been in place in this committee. I mean, the government's got to look at what their actions are. and the same concerns that in this legislative chamber when we were in session that I raised in my place with regards to a government that won't listen to processes and changes that the public deem to be necessary, needed, and appropriate, and we offer up constructive solutions. The government uses its voting majority against that to get whatever the Minister of Finance has predetermined over there, to destroy the Speaker's administration, to not uphold the parliamentary supremacy of this House. That's what we have experienced from this government. And now it's transcended from the chamber to the committee. And what other committees, Madam Chair, are going to have to suffer the same fate because the government, when the issue of the day doesn't suit their purpose or cause, will use their voting majority to just change the topic because they want to make sure that they're managing a message and manipulating an outcome that was previously agreed upon by the members of this committee when they do not want to uphold or agree with regards to consensus that we were willing to offer up as opposition parties, as part of trying to make the Public Accounts Committee function. How can they sit in this chamber and try to praise up the Auditor General and his staff? How can they sit here and do that when they're manipulating the working efforts of the people that this committee should call before it? How can we have an agenda-setting process right now when the NDP members have hijacked the process and will not be equal in their consideration? How can the Auditor General do his work effectively and appropriately if the government is going to continue? And the member before talked about grandstanding and silly positioning about the member from Preston. Well, I'll tell you, Madam Chair, he has lots of experience in it. And if he was truly sincere about his previous words, and if he wants to pull Hansard out, I'll go tit for tat any day with the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island. But he also better make sure, Madam Chair, that when they want to come forward and bring further motions to have this committee not do its work appropriately, then there's a concern. We've seen it from the floor of the House, and my concerns that I raised here that were dismissed by the government are proving true about what this government's agenda is.
Stick to this one, Mr. Clark.
Well, it is appropriate to this because it's consistent with the approach of the backroom maneuverings of the Premier, his political staff and cabinet to try and change things. And that's exactly what we're witnessing here in this committee again today. That's exactly the concerns that we would have. So my point is, Madam Chair, we needn't take a summer break. We needn't meet at all if issues are not going to be appropriately met. And we might as well just let the Auditor General go, do a report, and have government respond through, I guess, legislation to deal with these matters, because that's what we are effectively in the position of today. And the fact that the members are caught in their own process because what they've clearly said is we're derailing Gaming Corporation from coming forward because we've offered to have a second meeting. That's what it's all about. It's political strategy on behalf of the government. It's not about a practical process of administration or meetings of this committee. So let's be clear about what the NDP members are trying to pull here today. And if that's the case, there is no need for this committee to meet because it will effectively have been neutered by the government from actually being effective in responding to what the role and function of the Auditor General is supposed to be. And if the Auditor General himself were here today, I'd like to ask his opinion of what he thinks of the agenda-setting maneuvers of other people in terms of what he has tried to establish in a constructive plan, thought-out process associated with these things. And I know staff are here, but I'm just talking about the spokesperson that has been key to a lot of issues that we've been dealing with in the public fray. I would welcome any comment from them. But how can this committee possibly work at all? By virtue of the motion that the government NDP members have put forward here today, we might as well just, when we walk out of this chamber, not return to have a Public Accounts Committee again.
Well, I do understand you're feeling very strongly about this, Mr. Clark. I would like to just say a few comments as chair, because we've had this discussion in our agenda setting over the year about maintaining momentum and not missing weeks and not canceling meetings. And we have not met as frequently in this past year as we did the year before. And we've done a count of the meetings. This committee is actually noted across Canada as being one of the busiest. We have the most meetings proceedings. And if you look at this year, we did not. And part of the problem, and I had articulated it clearly to the Vice Chair of the committee and all members of the committee, is that we had not been effective in setting our agenda, sticking to our agenda, and getting items lined up and witnesses in. And, you know, it's very important to me that we don't lose ground. Right now, we've come today with the next 2 meetings scheduled and ready to break for the summer and come back in September with a good list of committee business. I wanted to have all of September filled up with good items, and the Auditor General's report departments could be brought forward at that time. He didn't say we needed to meet them immediately or meet in the summer to meet them. He just said, please schedule them. And the other point is that the environmental contamination issue has been dealt with this spring. We had Cisco and the environmental contamination group in once earlier prior to the report. When we had tried to schedule maintenance enforcement, we were told it wasn't necessary because they'd been in recently at another one of the committees. So I bring up the point that it is not so urgent that we would bump an established witness that's already lined up. And as I say, to add difficulty to that, this is a witness that we had pushed to come to this committee. And having done so with the approval of all committee members, that the fact that I wrote to Ms. Mullally was approved by all committee members. So I feel that we are then backtracking. We're losing ground on the momentum of the committee and the work of the committee. And I do fear that we wouldn't be able to schedule anything next week as well. So those are my concerns as chair, and I think it's important that all committee members consider that, because this committee is, unlike other committees, is really charged with accountability for government. And in a perfect world, it operates in a very nonpartisan way to further the work of accountability on the public accounts. And Mr. Ramey, you look like you don't believe me, but the training that we had in January was about the nonpartisan nature. It should be nonpartisan in its most perfect way. And maybe we'll schedule another training session. It is a privilege and a responsibility to be on this committee. I will say that. And Mr. Pereira, if you would like to follow up.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. We called this question quite a long time ago, and we certainly would like to see it go. But our main concern is that the chapters in the Auditor General's report be moved on, be examined, and that is what we're moving. So I move that we call the question and we move on.
Mr.
Thank
Caldwell.
you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Caldwell.
Yes, on the point of order, I agree with my colleague in the PC Caucus. This committee, I've never seen the like of it. I've been on this committee longer than anyone else in this chamber here today, longer than anyone, both in government and opposition, and it's unbelievable. I mean, we come here, we have an awful battle setting an agenda. It's very clear that my honourable colleague, the deputy chair of this committee, doesn't have support from his caucus when he goes back and agrees to something here. We've seen this over and over and over again. And if this committee is going to work, and the committee has to work, this is the accountability section of this legislature. This is part of the Legislative Assembly. Mm-hmm. The government decided to stack the committee so they can do anything they want here and not really have questions answered. And quite honestly, when we come here and we ask staff, like today, people didn't have the answers. They did not have the answers today that they should have had. They should have been better informed and provided us with more information. Is that because they're being told not to provide us with the information?
Mr. Caldwell,
and on the point of order that has been brought up, this has already been set. We went through a huge wrangle here to get this agenda set, and the Gaming Corporation to come here, and it wouldn't matter if it's a gaming corporation or what it is. The point is we already have our agenda set. I do believe that it's going to be an affront to this committee, to the people of Nova Scotia, that indeed this government wants no accountability, none. And this is a place to get accountability. And I've seen this more and more in other committees, and I'm just completely disgusted with the whole thing. Thank you.
Thank you. And are you calling for a recorded vote on this? Okay, is that seconded again?
It is seconded.
Thank you very much. Mr. Epstein, this is the motion to cancel the Gaming Corporation next week and try and replace them with the environmental remediation.
Aye.
And Mr. Wynot.
Yes.
Mr. Ramey?
Yes.
Mr. McKinnon?
Yes.
Mr. Prera?
Yes.
Mr. Caldwell?
No.
And Mr. Clark?
Nay.
And I vote no. The vote is 5-3, and the motion passes. That means we will instruct our clerk to move that forward. Mr. Clark.
Madam Chair, one of the things I was going to raise as well, I mean, you know that there's the annual meeting coming up in Quebec City with regards to Public Accounts Committee. As you would be aware, the Progressive Conservative Caucus will not be participating in that because of our policy, given the fact of the financial position we're in this province and the duplicity of the government on one front versus another. And so this is just more consistent. So I, Madam Chair, don't see why this committee needs to meet, because the government can just come in here and have their own session where they can sit around and pontificate about whatever spin they want to put on things. So with that said and done, Madam Chair, I have no need to stay here in this chamber and participate in a process that has been manipulated and is not sincere. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. And I do think it's a sad day to see our agenda, manipulated today or changed. It has never happened before in such a way, and without, full committee agreement. But we are here, and I would urge the members of the committee to help us set an agenda for September so that this committee can do the work that is very important to accountability in this province. This is a committee that has a long history. We've talked about democracy and history. It is an element that we, in fact, go abroad to try and introduce to other new developing democracies, and I hope that we can have a good functioning committee here. So I would ask Mr. Caldwell if you could put an item forward for September.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Caldwell. Point of order, Mr. Prera.
Madam Chair, we're not comfortable proceeding with the agenda at this time, given that the Conservative Party is not present. We have always worked on consensus, and we've always worked with the three parties together, and I would be hesitant to go forward with an agenda at this time without the presence of the Conservative Party.
Mr. Prera, there's a couple of issues. We actually set the original agenda with consensus, and the Gaming Corporation was on there. This has been arbitrarily removed based on your motion. I would like to just draw your attention back to the need to have an agenda set for September. And if we don't handle it today, and I realize it's been a long morning, if we don't handle it today, I would like the permission of the committee to call a separate agenda setting meeting, because I feel very strongly as chair, and I know you do as vice chair, that this committee has an important function and it has to have the cooperation of members to set the agenda. And I would hope that we will never see again a time when we are removing items that are duly set and organized. I think that has created some, certainly some concern today. Mr. Prera, I think first, then Mr. Caldwell.
Yes, Madam Chair, if you are proposing to have another agenda-setting meeting with the Conservative Party and all three parties present, we would concur with that.
I would like to hear from Mr. Caldwell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Unfortunately, you didn't recognize me initially. I move we adjourn the meeting today. It's a waste of time to be here. We come here every day, and the NDP are coming here and not want to really find out what's going on in the province, not provide us with that information. So I make a motion we adjourn.
Is that motion seconded? Thank you. Don't need to be seconded. We're adjourned. Thank you.